A campaign backflip after a work-from-home policy landed with a thud and an economic nuclear winter, markets react to the new world order under Trump's tariffs. I'm Oliva Caisley, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. The Coalition has backed away from its pledge to force public servants back to the office 5 days a week and soften their approach on cuts to the sector. Opposition leader Peter Dutton says the policy was a mistake and says Labor ran a scare campaign distorting their plan. Is it too late to convince voters? We'll ask Charlotte Mortlock from Liberal women's advocacy group the Hilmer Network. The Australian dollar has dropped below 60 US cents for the first time since the pandemic and the biggest daily fall in 17 years. Following the announcement of Donald Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs, Wall Street is now down more than 10% or US $9 trillion, with sharper falls still expected to come. The Australian share market has also plunged, with the benchmark ASX 200 index falling more than 6% at the open, before paring back to around 4% at lunchtime. What will this mean for Australian investors and homeowners? We'll get the latest from Deputy Chief Economist at AMP, Mousina, live in just a moment. And new federal Treasury modelling shows markets are expecting interest rate cuts and economic uncertainty as a result of US tariffs. Treasurer Jim Chalmers says his department has updated its modelling 3 times as decisions change, but says Australia will feel some impact. Has this brought back the risk of a recession? I'll ask Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles later this hour. Beginning with one of our top stories now, US President Donald Trump was defiant in the face of global stock market falls, telling reporters on Air Force One tariffs would put America in a powerful strategic position.
I spoke to a lot of leaders, European, Asian, from all over the world. They're dying to make a deal. But I said, we're not going to have deficits with your country. We're not going to do that, because to me a deficit is a loss. We're going to have surpluses, or we're at worst going to be breaking even.
Back home, Treasurer Jim Chalmers says the Australian economy will take a hit, but it will be manageable.
Today in Australia, the market lost about 4% of value. On Friday, the US about 6%. Asian markets have fallen quite dramatically today because they were closed for longer. I think Hong Kong was down about 9% when I last looked. We're also seeing this volatility in markets for gold as people look for safe assets. We're seeing it in the tumbling oil price as well. And we're seeing it in our own economy too when it comes to the Australian dollar bouncing around either side of 60 cents. That is largely a reflection of people's concerns about the Chinese economy, but it also reflects the fact that markets are now expecting around 4 interest rate cuts in Australia this calendar year.
As we mentioned in our headlines, the Australian stock market followed the US's downward trajectory today, with the ASX 200 dipping by as much as 6% at open before paring back some of those losses. Markets closed just over a minute ago. So let's get the latest from Deputy Chief Economist at AMP, Mousina. Thanks so much for speaking with us today. We had a bad plunge when the markets opened this morning. How have they closed?
Well, it hasn't been a good day on the share market, but I mean, that was largely to be expected because the Australian share market does normally tend to follow whatever the US does the night before. So our share market has closed by just over 4% over the day today. And since its peak earlier this year, the Aussie share market is down by about 10%. So that peak to trough fall is quite large, but actually not as bad as the US, which is down by about 17% from its peak. And once you get to a fall of about 20% or more in share markets, that's when people normally start talking about bear markets, which are basically the worst type of downturns and ones that are usually associated with a recession, which is why we're now getting a lot of this recession fears in the markets.
So Treasury today, they said that ongoing uncertainty in relation to trade hostilities and associated volatility in financial markets will weaken consumer and business confidence. They say this will have implications for consumption, business investment, including in Australia. How bad could the hit to consumer confidence be?
Look, I think that consumer confidence and business confidence will certainly get hit in the short term. However, I'm not so sure that there's then going to be that flow through into actual spending and investment decisions. Actually, consumer confidence in Australia has been shocking the last few years. It's been running around recessionary-like levels, and parts of consumer spending have actually held up pretty well. There have certainly been parts, particularly in retail, that haven't done so well, especially in the last 12 months, but it's been quite mixed for different consumer groups. For example, older consumers have actually still been spending a lot, whereas it's been the younger groups that have really been bunkering down and reducing their spending. So I guess I'm not convinced that we're going to have this big disastrous fall in consumer spending and business investment because of the US tariffs. And primarily the reason for that is because we don't have a strong impact to our economy directly from the tariffs. We only export about 5% of our total goods exports to the US. So Australia is not being hit that hard with these tariffs. We are going to face more of the indirect impact through a potential slowdown in global growth. Now, it does look like global growth is going to soften a bit in the next few months, the next few quarters, but we're not of the view that we're headed into a recession. I mean, it's certainly an increasing possibility, but it's not our base case. And unless we have a big fall in global growth, or we go down the path of a global recession or downturn, or a Chinese downturn, then we're not going to get as much of the direct hit to our consumption and our business investment growth here.
Well, that's really interesting. The market expectation is now that the Reserve Bank will cut interest rates more than once this year off the back of this economic volatility. Is that a good thing for consumers, or could this undo the soft landing that we've heard the Treasurer Jim Chalmers is speaking about?
So before the tariffs were announced last week, the market had priced in about two and a bit more rate cuts from the Reserve Bank this year. And that looked about fair. To me, our own view was that we would get 2 more rate cuts in May and in August this year. And after today's session, I think the markets are going to price in probably about 4 or 5 more rate cuts this year. But the market does bounce around a lot, and you can see that with the big falls in shares that we've had. I think we should be expecting a few more rate cuts from the RBA, whether it's 2 or 4. I think it will depend on how the inflation trajectory unfolds here. But I don't think that there's an emergency for the Reserve Bank to cut right now. I think we will get a 25 basis point cut in May, but that will be off the back of softer than expected inflation data. But I don't think we're going to get emergency rate cuts right now because we are not in a downturn domestically. We're not being hit directly. Okay. And further rate cuts for consumers will be good news, particularly for those with mortgages.
JP Morgan in the US is predicting a 60% chance of a recession over there. If that did happen in the United States, what would happen here? Could we have a recession ourselves?
A lot of US economists are now expecting a big chance of a recession in the next 12 months. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that historically Australia has been quite tied to what happens to US growth. But basically since about the 1990s, we've had quite different cycles to the US. When the US has had a downturn, we haven't necessarily had one. I mean, the GFC was a global crisis that did have a slowdown in Australian growth, but we didn't actually have a recession. So just because the US has a recession doesn't mean that we have to have one as well. And I don't think that the risk of a recession here is as high as 60%. I'd probably give it a 20% risk in the next 12 to 18 months. And I said the risk of a US recession is probably about 40% now in the next 12 months. But I think it's quite important to keep in mind that the Federal Reserve in the US can cut rates more to help growth. And I think that Trump will back down or negotiate away some of the highest tariffs that he's put in place to sort of get the markets not as fearful as they have been. I think that there are still some guardrails in place that will make the administration back off if things get really bad from here.
That's a good point. We don't know whether Donald Trump will change his mind. In Australia, though, what levers could the government pull to minimise the impact of economic volatility, not only in the United States but across the world, on our own markets?
Well, I don't think that the government really needs to do anything right now. I think it was very wise of Prime Minister Albanese to say that we're not going to retaliate with our own tariffs because fundamentally that would be bad for Australian consumers. It would mean higher prices for us. So I think that was a good move and that was the right decision by them. From what I suppose the Reserve Bank more can do is just to provide support that it can lower interest rates if need be. But then again, to reiterate to people that we have to focus on our own domestic economic conditions right now. Just because the US is imposing all these tariffs doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to hit Australia so hard. So as it stands right now, I don't think that the government or the Reserve Bank need to be doing anything extra. We're not in a crisis domestically. The fall in share markets isn't great for households, but share market declines are normal, and in 12 months' time, I think that shares will still be at a higher point than they are right now. So in the interim, we just need to try and manage downturn in markets, and that's what portfolio managers are doing right now.
Okay, so just in 20 seconds or so, because we don't have a lot of time, so you don't think at the moment we need to be deploying a stimulus or measures such as that to respond?
No, I don't think so. We're not in a crisis domestically.
All right, Diana, thank you so much for your time today, unpacking a huge story on the world stage.
Thanks so much.
It was the first day of week 2 of the election campaign today, and both leaders are now in Sydney in preparation for the first leaders' debate. Let's bring in our reporters from both the Labor and Coalition campaign. Stephanie Dalzell travelling with the Prime Minister, and Jake Evans, who has been with the Coalition. Welcome to you both. Now, Jake, to you first.
Afternoon, Liv.
Hey, the opposition leader spent a lot of the day explaining its backflip on its public service policy. Has it been a tough day on the hustings?
Yeah, good afternoon, Liv. Look, we've just made it to Sydney. As you can tell, we're on a bus heading out to Western Sydney, so it is a little bit hard to hear you, I will say. And we've made it here because Peter Dutton is preparing for the first leaders' debate tomorrow night with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. And today, as you say, he made an apology seeking to clear the air on an unpopular work-from-home policy that was proving unpopular and a distraction for the Coalition. So a bit of a band-aid rip to begin week 2 and have this issue out of the way before that leaders' debate tomorrow night. Peter Dutton saying that the Coalition will no longer pursue a return to office for all public servants, a demand that they be in the office 5 days a week with limited exceptions, instead saying that flexible working arrangements will be kept in place. He's also saying that the goal to slash public service jobs by 41,000 won't be achieved through forced redundancies. Instead, it would be achieved through a permanent hiring freeze and natural attrition, having that headcount tick down over time. It's left some questions over whether that can be achieved through natural attrition alone, but Coalition is asserting that the modelling has been done, with Parliamentary Budget Office confident that they can reach that goal. So that was the morning for Peter Dutton, spent in Adelaide, but he's quickly sought to move on. He ended his visit to the state with his third trip to a petrol station so far this campaign, this time arriving in a honking great big fuel truck emblazoned with their plan to cut the fuel excise by 25 cents, saying that'll save motorists money.
Jake, it was a great vision of Peter Dutton, I've got to say, driving in that enormous oil tanker, not something you see every day. Steph, I'll come to you now. Labor was keen to focus on the Coalition's work from home backflip today.
Yes, Liv, while Peter Dutton has backed away from the opposition's policy to force public servants back into the office, Labor wasn't backing down from its pursuit of this policy. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was in outer suburban Melbourne meeting with a couple who, not coincidentally, benefit hugely from flexible working arrangements and who work from home, and said they'd be financially worse off if they weren't able to do that. Now, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was questioned about the couple who actually aren't public servants. So even if the Coalition's policy had gone ahead, it wouldn't have impacted them. But Anthony Albanese argued that what happens in the public service often flows through into the private sector, while taking direct aim at Peter Dutton. He called him nasty and accused him of pretending to backflip on this issue.
Thank you both for your time. We miss you here in Canberra, but you're both doing a great job out on the campaign trail. Earlier, to wrap up the start of week 2 of the election campaign, we spoke to our political panel, Employment Minister Murray Watt and Shadow Housing Minister Michael Sukkar. Murray Watt and Michael Sukkar, thanks for joining us today. Michael, we've seen the coalition backflip on its working from home policy. It's gone down like a lead balloon with voters, especially in outer metropolitan seats that the coalition is hoping to pick up. What kind of feedback have you been getting in your electorate?
Well, look, I think this decision is an important one in the sense that we've listened to many stakeholders, we've listened to people in our communities, and we're willing to admit when we get it right and when we don't. And this is an important question, though, in general, in that we need a productive public sector, but we know that flexible working arrangements can still maintain that productivity that's necessary. There are many ways to drive productivity in the public sector, and we'll be seeking to do that, but flexible work arrangements are important as well for retaining the best people and attracting the best people. Indeed, it's going to be, I think, going forward, an important component of any workforce strategy. And let's not forget either that it was the former coalition government that really ushered in, admittedly at the time of COVID, but ushered in these very flexible working arrangements. So in many respects, I think it's natural for us to continue with that policy, and I think unlike the Labor Party, which has been running around this whole election campaign telling people that they've never had it better, telling people that things are wonderful, you've got to admit when you get it wrong, and the Labor Party certainly can't admit how devastatingly they have managed this economy over 3 years, which is why people are poorer now than they were at the last election. I think honesty in politics is something that ultimately people mark up.
Michael, I do appreciate that honesty, but on this question, though, on this sense of retaliation, you hold your seat on an ultra thin margin of just 0.2%. Were you getting negative feedback from voters on this very policy?
I haven't personally received negative feedback, but I think the concept of flexible work is one that we all see in our own lives. We want to drive a productive public sector, there's no doubt about it. Labor has run a shocking scare campaign that somehow this was targeted at private arrangements between private employers and their employees, which in a sense you'd expect Labor to do because they've got such a bad story to tell of their 3 years in government. But we think that there are ways in which we can ensure the productivity of our public service, which in the end are answerable to taxpayers, and taxpayers expect productivity out of our public service. But flexible work arrangements, I think, are really important at retaining the highest quality, the best talent in our public service. So I'm very pleased with this decision today.
All right, Murray, I'll come to you on this now. Do you think Peter Dutton deserves some credit for coming out with a mea culpa of sorts and owning that this was a policy mistake?
Olivia, I think the problem for Peter Dutton is that no one believes him when he says he now supports working from home. And we've heard a valiant effort there from Michael to defend this change of heart from Peter Dutton and the coalition. But it goes against everything they've been saying for the last few weeks. Over the last few weeks since the coalition announced this policy that they would ban working from home for federal public servants, we've had members of the coalition out there describing working from home as a holiday, as unproductive, and we saw Peter Dutton say that women should just job share rather than work from home. So how is anyone supposed to believe that these people are now telling the truth when they say that they support work from home? I think, and more importantly, I think Australians think, that the risk of Peter Dutton and the coalition cutting their wages and conditions is just as high as it was today as it was yesterday. But I think the more important thing for Peter Dutton is that he's losing all credibility in terms of anything that he says and anything that he stands for. Over the last few days, we've seen Peter Dutton and the coalition say that they support more homes when they've actually opposed and blocked us building homes. They're now saying that they support work from home when for weeks they've been saying they oppose it. They've said they're trying to work out whether they support same job, same pay, which has enabled labour hire workers to get fairer rates of pay when they've spent the entire term voting against that and every other thing we've done to lift wages. So, as I say, I think the risk for people with their wages and conditions is just as high from Peter Dutton and the coalition as it was yesterday, no matter what kind of papering over in an insincere way that he does now.
All right, moving on. It's obviously been a topsy-turvy day on the stock market. A lot of Australians are going to be worried about their superannuation. Murray, I'll come to you first. The conventional wisdom is that voters in times of uncertainty like this will stick with the incumbent. Is there a risk, though, that economic volatility will upend the government's argument that the economies have turned a corner? A global recession isn't off the cards, is it?
Well, I guess I'll leave it for the commentators to predict what people will think of this and how they'll react, Olivia. But what we can say is that, the times are very volatile, and we've seen that again on the stock market today. But the Australian economy is much better prepared for this sort of turmoil than it was in the state that it was left behind by the coalition. Jim Chalmers, Katie Gallagher, the Prime Minister and others have worked very hard to repay over $170 billion worth of Liberal debt, recording 2 surpluses in a row, bringing down inflation and keeping unemployment low at the same time as we've lifted wages, despite the Liberals voting against that. So we've done everything we can to manage the economy in an economically responsible way, and that makes us as well prepared as we possibly can be. The reality is we are in some pretty uncertain times when it comes to the global economy. I think that Australians will look at the government's record and the efforts that we've made to repay that debt, improve those surpluses, get inflation down and unemployment low, and I think there's a good chance that people will say that's what they want, rather than the kind of reckless and risky processes and decision making we continue to see from Peter Dutton. As I say, this decision about work from home to now walk away from something they've been pledging for weeks, I think it just shows that the Liberals and Peter Dutton are reckless, they are risky, and they are exactly the wrong kind of people to be running the economy at these uncertain times.
Michael, the ALP has been trying to tie Peter Dutton to Donald Trump. Could the US president's trade war make Peter Dutton's task of gaining seats even harder on May 3?
Well, I think these tumultuous times will tell the exact opposite story to what Murray Watt has just said. I mean, Murray is essentially aping the talking points from the Labor Party this whole campaign, which is essentially telling people, suspend what you've seen over the last 3 years, ignore your lived experience over the last 3 years. You've enjoyed this golden age of prosperity under the Labor Party for the last 3 years, and stick with us because you'll just get more of the same for the next 3 years. Well, I agree, you will get more of the same under the Labor Party in the next 3 years, and that is you will be demonstrably poorer again after the Labor Party if they are re-elected. We've seen 3 years after their election when they promised cheaper mortgages, when they promised that, or Anthony Albanese promised that life would be cheaper under him. He promised $275 reductions in energy. None of those have been delivered. In fact, people's lives have just got harder. They've run out of Liberal money, and now we have 10 years of deficits in front of us, hundreds of billions of dollars of deficits. We've got gross debt heading up to $1.2 billion. There's no money stashed away for a rainy day. Labor's not put money away for a rainy day. Labor's been spending like drunken sailors, and we are not in a position to withstand the volatility that we are now seeing. Now, of course, we all hope as Australians that we're able to withstand some of the tumultuous economic times ahead, but that won't be aided by a Labor government who, just like we see from Labor governments for time immemorial, they spend, they don't know how to manage the economy. That's why we find ourselves in the position we are now. And no matter how much Murray Watt or Anthony Albanese run around the country telling people how good they should be feeling economically, people are struggling to pay their bills. People have seen 29,000 small businesses in their communities fall over. Walk down any main street and the number of for lease signs you see on buildings, that tells the story of the economic state of this country. And sadly, Labor has squandered the mining resources that were gifted to them. They've squandered the Liberal money that saw them through the last few years. And now we head into 10 years of hundreds of billions of dollars of deficits. And I feel like many Australians, we're not in as strong as possible position as we should be to withstand those challenges that are inevitably coming.
Murray, I'll just give you an opportunity to respond to Michael there. I mean, as we know, the Albanese government delivered back-to-back surpluses, but looking forward, there are deficits well into the future. Do you think the budget and indeed the Australian economy is resilient enough to withstand this volatility that we're seeing?
Yes, I do, Olivia, and unfortunately for Michael, the facts don't back up what he's saying. The reality is that when we came to office, we inherited a budget that was massively in deficit for years to come. Despite that, we turned the budget around as a result of the savings that we imposed on public sector spending and a range of other measures that saw us achieve 2 surpluses in a row when the outgoing coalition government was predicting deficits. And even the deficit that we're forecasting for the coming year is substantially lower than what it was forecast to be when we came to office. But on the cost of living point, again, we have worked incredibly hard this term to support people through what have been really tough times. And every step of the way, we've seen Peter Dutton and the Coalition oppose what we've tried to do. They've opposed every change to our workplace laws, which are lifting wages and are now seeing wages grow ahead of inflation. Remember, when we came to office, they were not keeping pace with inflation, but Peter Dutton and the Coalition voted against every one of those changes. They voted against our energy rebates until the eve of the election. They've opposed our cheaper medicines, our cheaper childcare. Initially, they opposed the tax cuts that we provided for low and middle income earners. And incredibly, we go to this election with a Liberal party saying that they want to increase taxes if they win the next election by repealing what we've just done. So I'm very happy to have a debate with Michael or any member of the Coalition about cost of living support, because the record shows that Labor has acknowledged the difficult times people have been going through and are still going through, and that we've taken many steps to try to address that and been opposed every step of the way by the Coalition.
Murray, can I just ask you, we just had the federal budget handed down. Are a lot of the assumptions contained in that now outdated, given what we've seen with this Trump tariff regime?
Well, you may have seen today Jim Chalmers made the point that he has asked Treasury to do some new modelling about the likely impact of the tariff reductions, of the tariff imposition. And again, these tariff impositions are a bad decision from the US that we strongly oppose. The Treasury modelling shows that we're not likely to see an enormous impact directly from the US tariffs, but it could be that we see some impact through the indirect impact on the global economy. So that is something that we will be monitoring closely. Again, it shows that we are living in uncertain times, and people will have a choice to make about whether they stick with a Labor government that's had their back over the last 3 years and has got our budget into better shape, or whether they take a punt with Peter Dutton and the Coalition, who are reckless and risky, and you never know from one day to the next what they're going to stand for.
I would just add, though, that this is the third time Treasury has had to update its modelling, because it's clear that we have no idea what Donald Trump will do next. But I will just move on now. Michael, the Coalition's promised to have 30,000 fewer international students in Australia than Labor proposed last year. Not everyone is happy about this idea, though. We've seen some comments from the international education sector today describing this policy as straight out of Donald Trump's playbook. Why didn't you consult with them more closely before releasing this policy?
Well, we want to make sure that young Australians have an opportunity for home ownership. We want to ensure that Australians can get a rental when they need one. We've seen rents under this government up by 18%. We've seen fewer homes being built, fewer homes being completed, fewer homes being approved, and of course fewer first home buyers. And part of the reason for that is that the Labor government has brought in more than 1 million people over 2 years. You can't bring in more than 1 million people in a short period of time of 2 years without any idea of where those people are going to live. And obviously international students are a component of those overseas arrivals that have been putting pressure on our housing market. There's only one party going to this election, and it's the Liberal Party and, of course, the National Party coming to this election talking about home ownership for young Australians. We are not willing to wave the white flag on home ownership for young Australians, and you cannot have a massive migration program when you're not building enough homes and when you've got no idea of where those people are going to live. And Murray talks about the Labor government's record on housing. We've got fewer homes that have been built, fewer homes approved, fewer first home buyers. On every single metric, this government has delivered fewer homes, yet they decided to run a world record migration program for Australian purposes of over 1 million people in 2 years. So we've got to make these decisions. And of course, Olivia, the universities who have been making billions and billions of dollars may not be happy about this, but we have an obligation to younger Australians to give them an opportunity to own a home, give them an opportunity to find a rental because I can tell you, in my home state of Victoria, you go to some open for inspections for rentals and the queues are literally around the block. That is not a situation we're willing to accept. And one scary statistic, over the last couple of years, for every single new purpose-built student accommodation unit that has been approved, there have been 42 international students arrive. So that's 42 people for every student accommodation being built or approved. It's totally out of whack. That's what has put huge amounts of pressure, particularly on the Melbourne and Sydney rental markets. And our obligation is to the next generation of Australians and giving them an opportunity to one day own a home, but in the meantime to also have a secure roof over their head in a rental that they can afford, not 20% higher than what was the case when Labor was elected just 3 years ago.
And Murray, could I quickly get your response to this? There were critics of Labor's own student cap targets last year. Do you think that the impact of international students on housing more generally is overstated?
Well, I guess what I think, Olivia, is that our government, the Labor government, has been taking action to both bring down international student numbers and migration in general. We've recognised that migration levels are too high, and some of that is about the kind of visa system that we inherited from Peter Dutton, being the former immigration minister. Migration numbers are now down more than 30% of what they were when we came to office. International student numbers are down by about 30% as well because of the caps that we've been imposing. And the problem for Michael, Peter Dutton and all the rest of them who want to tell this story is that only last year they had an opportunity to vote for legislation which would have reduced international student numbers. They didn't do that. They voted against that legislation. And now, of course, on the eve of an election, they want to bring international student numbers down. So there's this pattern across all policy areas where on the eve of an election, Peter Dutton and the coalition are saying certain things that they believe in or want to do. But if you look back at what they've done for the last 3 years, it's been diametrically the opposite. They say they want higher wages. They've voted against higher wages. They say they want better Medicare. They've voted against better Medicare. They say they want more homes. They voted against more homes. They say they want less migration. They voted against lower migration. So they'll say anything they want to try to win this election. But as Peter Dutton himself said, the best predictor of future performance is your past performance. People can see the position that these guys have taken and know that they are not the people with the best plan for Australia.
Michael Murray, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thanks, Olivia.
Thanks, Olivia.
Lost in some of the tariff madness today was a coalition's policy to slash the number of overseas students in a bid to free up homes for younger Australians. The opposition says it will limit the number of overseas students starting studies each year to 240,000 and impose a percentage cap on public universities only. Abul Rizvi is a former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration and joins us now. Abul, thanks for joining us today. The coalition, they've promised this cap and limit that to 240,000 each year. It's a figure that is 30,000 less than what Labor proposed last year. What kind of immediate impacts would this coalition policy have?
30,000 is not a huge number compared to the level that Labor was intending to cap overseas students. I think the more significant thing here is the rebalancing of the overseas visa system between public universities and the private vet sector. Over the last 2 years, the Labor government has very significantly tightened policy on the private vet sector, such that the number of private vet sector students coming to Australia now is very, very low. And at the same time, we're seeing the coalition announcing a cap on vet students of 95,000. Compared to the number of vet students that are currently coming into the country, that is actually an increase, a significant increase in vet students coming into the country. The thing that we need to most understand about this, however, is that both caps and very big increases in visa application fees are blunt instruments. They do nothing to improve the quality of students coming to Australia. Indeed, they probably make it worse. Secondly, there is nothing in caps and increases in student visa fees that do anything about the integrity of the student visa system. And finally, they do nothing about targeting skills. In my view, caps and increasing student visa fees are really, really poor policy instruments.
And can you just clarify, when you say VET, you mean the vocational education sector?
Oh, yes, that's right. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I will get to that sector in just a second, but can you explain to our viewers how a cap would work or how it could be implemented?
My understanding is the intention is to cap the number of student commencements each year for each provider. So there is approximately 1,400 providers in the system, and each would get an allocation that would have to be negotiated ultimately with them. I suspect every one of the 1,400 providers would probably dispute the cap that they would get. And each year, the government would need to enter into another negotiation with the 1,400 providers for the caps they would get. It would be absolutely chaotic.
And can you help me understand this? I saw research from the Property Council earlier this year, and it suggested just 4% of Australia's rental properties, so less than 1 in 20, are occupied by international students. More broadly, as an issue, is the impact of students on housing pressures overstated? Does that 4% figure sound correct to you?
Yes, it's probably about right. And I do think a lot of this is overstated. I think it's worth considering that just before COVID, the number of overseas students in Australia was around 650 odd thousand. Today, it's around 750 odd thousand. So the increase between the period before COVID and the period today is actually not that large, even though we had that very big surge in student arrivals in 22 to 24.
So do you think it's misleading then for the coalition to claim that we've now seen I believe it's 850,000 student increase?
Oh, well, there are 850 odd thousand students in Australia when you count those students who are in Australia on bridging visas. There's about 120 odd thousand on bridging visas. But prior to COVID, there was also a large number of students on bridging visas. So you've got to try to count like with like. The biggest worry I have is this claim that the changes the government is proposing will free up 40,000 homes. I've done my calculations on that, and frankly, I don't get anywhere near freeing up 40,000 homes. I get to a figure much less than 20,000.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, remember on this issue of student caps, the coalition opposed Labor's own legislation last year on the basis it wasn't going far enough. Was that Labor policy chaotic, as the opposition suggested at the time?
Oh, I think caps are generally chaotic. Whoever is going to introduce caps, it will be chaotic. But the point is, if you do want to cap overseas students at the provider level, you need the legal power to be able to do so. What that legislation did was provide government with that legal power. So currently, that legal power does not exist. If Mr Dutton wants to implement caps at the provider level, he will need to go back to Parliament and secure that power. It will be interesting how he debates that with the Labor Party, given he opposed giving them that power.
Australia's applications are among the most expensive in the world. It's certainly a renewing concern among experts that foreign students are merely being used as cash cows, really, in a political debate over immigration. Do you have a view on that element?
Oh, our fees are at the moment around $1,600, and that's around double the next highest fee in the world. Increasing them to $5,000 will really mean that the best students, the very best students who have options in terms of where they will go, will tend to shun Australia and go elsewhere, and we will tend to get lesser quality, lesser performing students who have fewer options coming to Australia. That is the reverse of what we should be aiming for.
It seems that the biggest change the coalition's proposing compared to Labor's own student capping plans, the overseas student program that shifts the balance towards the private vet sector or vocational education sector you mentioned earlier, is either party offering anything to deal with the fact that this sector, it's got a long history of rorts and dodgy qualifications?
I think what we've seen over the last 2 years is a very dramatic decline in applications and visa grants to the private vet sector. In addition, additional money has been given to the regulator to clamp down on shonky colleges. That has been good policy in my view, and I think it would be dangerous to reverse the direction of that policy. There were further measures to increase integrity in the legislation that Mr Dutton opposed. I think those measures should be allowed to proceed.
Abul Rizvi, thank you so much for breaking down this policy area for us today.
You're welcome.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has defended the announcement of the government's plan to return the Port of Darwin to Australian ownership, telling reporters this morning discussions had been happening over a period of time. A short time ago, we spoke to Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles about this and the carnage on the stock market today. So we're joined today by the Defence Minister, Richard Marles. Thanks so much for joining us, during which I know is a very busy campaign period. Let's start with the Port of Darwin. So Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says that he'll buy back the Port of Darwin, but we don't have a lot of detail. What exactly is Labor's plan here?
Well, we will work through processes if we are fortunate enough to be re-elected, and that we'd like to see a commercial option obviously reached first, but clearly we do have powers, so one way or another we will ensure that as soon as we can practicably do it, the Port of Darwin will be back in Australian hands. Okay,
so there isn't a concrete plan right now?
Well, we're in conversations with the Territory Government, firstly, and that's they are ultimately the ones who've done the leasing of the Port of Darwin, but done so in cooperation with the then government, the former Liberal government, which facilitated the sale of the Port of Darwin. So we will work with them. We'll work with the owner of the lease, and we would prefer clearly a commercial option, but ultimately we do have powers here, and if needs be, we'll exercise them.
So is it going to differ from what the coalition's proposing, essentially forcing Landbridge Group to sell back the port to a government-approved operator?
Well, again, we'll work this through with the Territory Government, obviously with Landbridge itself, and we would like to see a commercial option. That would be the quickest way and clearly the cleanest way, but at the end of the day, we do have powers that are available to us as the Commonwealth, and we will use them if we needs be.
All right, can you please help me explain some of the timeline here? So in October 2023, the Department of Prime Minister's Cabinet confirmed the departments and agencies did not think that the lease for the Port of Darwin needed to be varied or voided. Have our security agencies changed that advice?
Look, from the first moment that the Liberals sold the Port of Darwin back in 2015, we expressed enormous concern that the Port of Darwin was being sold to a Chinese-controlled entity. I mean, that's a decade ago, and we've been consistently on the record for 10 years expressing our concern about the Liberal sale of the Port of Darwin to a Chinese-controlled entity. Now, we were saying it at the time that it occurred. In the lead up to the last election, we made it clear about our anxiety. We've retained that anxiety in government. Yes, we've been seeking advice along the way, but we've had a deep concern about these arrangements. We've been speaking with the Territory Government in February this year. When I was in Darwin for the commemoration of the bombing of Darwin, I was making it clear that this was a matter under active consideration, and now we've made the decision. At the end of the day, the Liberals, when they sold this to a Chinese-owned entity, should never have done it. They created a problem, and now it's the Albanese government which is fixing it.
I understand that, but I mean, we did hear from Foreign Minister Penny Wong last week. She said that this decision was taken at a political level. Does that mean that the security advice on this hasn't changed?
We've sought advice, but we've retained our concern about this from the outset. We've had a deep concern about the fact that the Port of Darwin was in the hands of a Chinese-controlled entity, and so ultimately that, and there's been no secret about that. I mean, that concern has been very clear and very clearly expressed by us over the course of the last decade. This is an opportunity to bring those concerns into to give them proper expression through resolving this and resolving it in a way which sees the port back in Australian hands.
So to be clear, no change in security advice?
Well, I'm not going to go into all the advice that we get. We've had a dialogue with those agencies that do provide us advice, but what's been really clear is our consistent position over a decade, and now we're giving expression to that.
You've had two really important meetings in the past 6 weeks with Samuel Paparo, the Defence Secretary of the United States, Pete Hegseth. Did either of these two mention the Port of Darwin in any of your discussions?
Well, again, I'm not going to go into those conversations beyond what I've already said publicly and as the outcome of those conversations, and it's important that we're able to maintain those conversations within the confidentiality they provide. So I'm not about to go into them, but I mean, when people are trying to assess where are we coming from here, we are coming from the place that we started from, and that is that we have had a real concern about this from the moment that it happened, and now we are resolving this by bringing this into Australian hands.
So to summarise, if you are to be re-elected, you'll then come forward with a plan to essentially ensure that this port comes back into Australian hands.
Well, that's right. I mean, we will seek a commercial solution. If that can be reached, that would be ideal. If not, we'll exercise the powers that the Commonwealth has to ensure this is brought into Australian hands, and we'll do all of that as quickly as practicable.
We have seen the markets and the value of the Australian dollar absolutely tumbling today. We've got budget deficits into the future. Ultimately, how resilient do you think the Australian economy is, and indeed the federal budget when it comes to dealing with some of these economic challenges?
Well, as both the Treasurer and the Finance Minister have made clear in their comments today, we are in a very resilient position. And that's by virtue of the prudent way in which our government has been managing the budget over the last 3 years. Well, we are $207 billion ahead of what we inherited from the coalition, and that's a result of really diligent, prudent management of the budget. And when you look at the measured way in which we have been managing the budget, on the one hand, compared with total fiasco that we've seen on the part of Peter Dutton and backflipping on policies today on the other, I mean, there is a stark difference between the styles of what the Liberals would represent in government and what they were in government and what we have been and what we will be given the opportunity. The fact that we are $207 billion better off, the fact that in each and every year of the forward estimates going forward, the budget bottom line is better under us than what it would have been under the Liberals, and that's based on the PFO from the last election. But given that we've had two budget surpluses in the last 3 years, all of this means that we are in a position to deal with what is clearly going to be a challenging environment going forward. But the final point I make is that when we look at the global economic environment, we still are confident about our economy growing. We've been able to keep it growing throughout the period that we've been in government, something that cannot be said for many other developed economies, but we're really confident that we'll be able to keep it growing into the future.
On this volatility, though, is there a risk, though, the government's going to have to rethink some of the spending it's committed to? Labor has committed to increasing spending on defence, in particular in your area. Do you think there might need to be a recalibration of that?
Well, what we've demonstrated is the prudent and measured way in which we've gone about managing the budget. You know, two budget surpluses, something that the Liberals said they would do and never did. Making sure that in each and every year of the forward estimates, we're in a better position than what we inherited from the Liberals. So we will continue to manage the budget in that way. The risk here is Peter Dutton becoming the Prime Minister and the Liberals taking over the reins of the budget again. Because what they did over the better part of a decade is leave us with $1 trillion of debt without anything to show for it. When we came to government, inflation was at 6.1% and going north. Now it's 2.4% and reducing. You know, the risk here is that you have the kind of chaotic management of public affairs, such as what we've seen from the coalition today, in charge of the budget going into the future, when we really are facing a pretty challenging world.
So there's reporting out this morning that Australian diplomats are going to wait a month or so before approaching Donald Trump's trade team over the removal or watering down of these 10% tariffs we've had imposed on Australian products. Ultimately, can you confirm that those talks are now on ice?
We will continue to make the case to the Trump administration, and we will do that in the most sensible way possible, and in the most forceful way possible, and as we have done up until now. I mean, we'll continue to make the case that this is not good, not just for Australia, but for America and American jobs. And that will continue to be the case going forward in terms of the way in which we advocate to the Trump administration. But I'd also make the point that what in the 5-point plan that Anthony Albanese announced last week when the tariff decision came through, we're also very much focused on our own resilience, making sure that we're helping, for example, those companies that are affected by this to find other markets, making sure that we build a resilience stream in the National Reconstruction Fund. We will be building our own economic resiliency in the face of this American decision, whilst at the same time doing everything we can to advocate for a change in the decision.
Defence Minister Richard Marles, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Returning to the Coalition's policy backflip on public servants, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton apologised for the policy this morning, saying there would be now no changes to flexible working arrangements under a coalition government. He also said Labor had misrepresented their policy.
We got it wrong and we've apologised for it. We support flexible workplace arrangements, and our plan, which was only ever targeted for the public service in Canberra, Labor's been able to create into a scare campaign, which is not what it was intended. And as I've said before, we will make sure that we can help families, and that's exactly what our positive plan of getting our country back on track is about.
One of the central criticisms of the opposition's former policy on working from home was that it disadvantaged working women with young children who benefited from flexibility in the workplace. Charlotte Mortlock is the founder of Hilmer's Network, a group advocating for more women to be involved in Liberal Party-aligned politics. And she joins me now. Charlotte, thanks so much for speaking to us today. You're a proud Liberal member, a champion of women in the party, and started the Hilmer's Network to specifically get more women into the party. What's going on here with this working from home policy? It's gone down like a bit of a lead balloon with voters, especially women. Should this have been cauterised earlier?
Thanks so much for having me on, Olivia. I think, in that clip we heard there that this has been an incredibly effective scare campaign from Labor. So, kudos where kudos and credit is due. But ultimately, we put forward a policy idea that wasn't popular. And I personally think that it is fantastic to see a leader take on that feedback, be receptive to it, and say, we got it wrong, we made a mistake, and move on from that. And, I know we are in an election at the moment, so things feel very polarised and life and death, but at a time when we're seeing some world leaders be exceptionally pig-headed and persevere with policy that is not only unpopular but gravely dangerous, I actually think it's fantastic to see a party leader in Australia coming forward and being receptive and open-minded to that feedback.
Yeah, so do you think that voters will be receptive or respect the fact that Peter Dutton has issued this mea culpa of sorts?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, the reason why this has been such a visceral issue, I think, for women, but also for lots of dads, it's really for young families, is because life is really hard for young families at the moment, and that is under an Albanese cost of living crisis. And the problem that we have at the moment is that there is a portion of Australians who want workers back in the office full-time, but largely that portion is actually retirees. And I don't like to pit generations against each other because I don't find it helpful, but I do think this is an unprecedented time. Because of this cost of living crisis, young families aren't able to make choices for themselves because every household needs to be a dual income, full-time working household just to make ends meet, just to be able to rent, let alone own a home. And I think that that is why this has been so visceral. They're struggling to make ends meet, and that commute, be it, an hour or so a day or 2 hours, you would want to spend that with your children, cuddling your kids, engaging with them, or better yet, putting on a load of washing or doing the cooking and those sorts of things, as opposed to commuting. So I personally am pro, being in the office. I see the economic, the social cohesion, those benefits. But that's in a utopia when we get to make decisions. And this is not a utopia. This is a cost of living crisis. Young families are finding it hard, and we need to make sure that we are making their lives as easy as possible.
We know from some of the data that it's a lot of these seats in outer metropolitan suburbs, which is certainly considered Peter Dutton's pathway to victory, that they're the electorates where this policy hasn't gone down so well. A lot of them have bought homes outside of the cities because that's all they could afford. They're spending a lot of time in the car, and indeed they like working from home. It makes their lives a lot easier. How do you think the coalition can best appeal to these voters now and change their decline in opinion, given the fact that we are very close to election day?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I do think they are in this bind where they're desperate to work from home because life is so hard. And that is a result of the Albanese cost of living crisis. So if we can really focus on how we can improve the economy for them, I think that is going to be the most helpful thing. But, you know, make no mistakes, I have complete sympathy for those young families who are, you know, the sandwich generation. They are looking after their ageing, if not dying parents at the same time that they are in the trenches of looking after young kids. And as I said, they both have the expectation that they have to work full time just to survive in a cost of living crisis. So if we can reduce the financial burden on those young families, we will actually see the young families be empowered to decide what is best for them and if it works better with one parent working full time or both, but in a way that suits them.
Can I just quickly ask, you've got a very active network. Were you hearing any sort of negative feedback on the specific policy over the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, I think we definitely had some feedback from women that I think the scare campaign was so effective that everyone thought they would be affected by it, as opposed to just the public sector. And, you know, as I said, that's a result of Labor's scare tactics. But I do think that there were a lot of people that had empathy of just trying to make ends meet at the moment, just trying to get through the day. And a lot of families were reliant on that extra time. It's not even that they didn't want to be in the office. I think it's the commuting part that takes hours of their day that they would prefer to spend otherwise.
Women voted resoundingly against Scott Morrison in 2022. Is the party making progress under Peter Dutton when it comes to improving female representation? What's your assessment? Is he doing a better job?
Yeah, I think that one of the really wonderful things that we have seen in this term is that the membership has actually got behind women. So in really key seats that are high profile, we've actually seen the pre-selectors in the Liberal Party back in women. And that is a huge gain, in my opinion, and something that we didn't see in the last election. Now, that means that women are front and centre in this campaign. Be it, you know, Giselle Kaptarian in Bradfield or Jamie Rogers or Amelia Hamer. They are front and centre in this campaign, and that's a credit to the Liberal Party membership. Now, if you want to see a Liberal Party that has more women in it, the best way we can do that is to vote for Liberal women.
So are you feeling sort of winds of change within the party at a grassroots level on improving that representation level?
Yeah, and I even know, like, the Young Liberals, they have a federal female president, they have a New South Wales female president, South Australia, Queensland female president. So we're seeing that at a grassroots level, that there is starting to be engagement with lots of women at a younger age. And we're just trying to fill that gap between 30 and 60, which is really what Hilmers is aiming to do. So I have seen that, I'm impressed with that, and I'm impressed with the pre-selectors coming on board and backing women in. I'm not here to give party lines. I will always advocate for more women to be pre-selected, but I do think that this is certainly a step in the right direction, and the calibre of the women that we have been able to attract in these high-profile seats blows me away, just how impressive their careers are and what they could contribute not only to the Liberal Party but to our country.
We've also over the weekend seen the disendorsement of the Liberal candidate for the New South Wales seat of Whitlam after he suggested women shouldn't serve in the army. How do you think this has been handled by the party?
I think the right decision was made. I think that those comments were disgraceful, and I think that we needed to do what we did, which was disendorse him and put in a new candidate, and I think that that has been well received. I think that was the right call.
And can I ask, we did see the Hume Loughnane review into the 2022 federal election result, and it didn't think that quotas would be the right move for the Liberal Party. Do you think that conversation needs to be reopened in 20 seconds, if you could please?
We'll wait and see. But at this stage, vote for Liberal women, and that's the fastest way we can solve it. A pitch in 20 seconds for you.
Oh, I really appreciate that. It's always a good speaking to you, Charlotte, and I appreciate you speaking with us today.
Thanks, Olivia.
That's afternoon briefing for today. It's going to be a busy week, week 2 of the election campaign. We're going to see both the opposition leader Peter Dutton facing off against the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in the first leaders' debate of the campaign. Both sides are no doubt wanting to build momentum. Stay with us here on ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories.